I've chosen to put two women on the shelf that I have endowed, if that's the word. Ada Lovelace, who I think is probably quite well known as a very early theoretical mathematician and the inventor of computer programming. And the second woman may be less well known, but is a personal heroine of mine, Victoria Drummond. She was a Scotswoman who became the first woman to become a ship's engineer in the British Merchant Navy, and she's a heroine of mine because many years after she retired, I became a deck officer in the Merchant Navy, and I was one of the first to do that. When Glasgow Women's Library was in one of its previous premises, I became interested in the history of women in science and engineering, and the first place I came was to the Glasgow Women's Library, and I discovered that although they had lots of books and archives about women doing everything else, they had nothing about women in science and engineering. And this is something I think was a bit of a gap in their collection, which is why I wanted to endow the shelf.
Lynette's my woman on the shelf because she is a feminist, first and foremost. She's an educator, and she's also a very close friend that I'm happy to say I'm still working alongside. Glasgow Women's Library is such a feminist institution, and it just seemed right that Lynette would be immortalised within Glasgow Women's Library, but also not just Lynette, but also her approach. And I think that what Lynette done in her education is very similar to Glasgow Women's Library in that way, that it's about developing the person, not necessarily to provide a service or to be a particular type of role. It's about that person themselves developing, and I think Lynette's name belongs in the Women's Library because it's a very similar approach. I think for too long women have been missing from history, and we're getting better at looking at people like Mary Barber from the rent strikes, and we're getting better at recognising women in quite official positions. I think what the Women's Library offers is an opportunity to remember those women who have developed our communities in that traditional feminist way, where they're flying under the radar but influencing so much. Glasgow Women's Library opens up the world for women, I think.
The woman to whom I want to dedicate a shelf is called Rosella Hightower. She was actually one of 5 Native American women who developed a career in ballet in the 1940s and 1950s, but she was, I think, the one who had the most recognition on the international stage. I first learned about her in a comic that I was reading for girls as a 13, 14-year-old. The comic had a special feature. Every so often they would have a feature of women who had done something, who had made something of themselves, obviously designed to make girls like me think, well, I could be like her. I then attended a film at the GFT, which was looking at the work of a ballet company. I saw her interviewed when she was a lady of 80, talking about her life. And it was just seeing her almost at the beginning of my life and at the beginning of her life, seeing this lady who was still elegant and refined and so distinguished. And it was almost like kind of, for me, closing the circle of her life.
I certainly felt like I wanted to put a woman on the shelf. It was quite a challenge, I think, to decide who that might be, because certainly I've got women in my own family that I would have nominated there, and a host of women who have changed the course of history as well in the public eye. But in the end, I decided to sponsor a shelf and dedicate it to the artist Joan Eardley, whose work I love, who died very prematurely, and whose work I think, and whose life I think, needs more recognition, and I'm really proud that Joan is one of our women on the shelf.